All right, very good. Okay, staff.
Okay, we have Director Hamid as well as Eric, I forget his last name, sorry, from Burke Williams. So I'll let Director Hamid say a few words while Eric gets signed in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Town Manager, Mayor, and Council. The Council approved in February of 2021 the goal to identify funding, create an action plan, and initiate work on the sixth cycle housing element to satisfy the regional housing needs allocation, RHNA, meet state mandates, and maintain the town's semi-rural character consistent with the general plan. On October 6th, staff and the selected consultant, Barry Miller and Consultants, provided a joint Town Council and Planning Commission kickoff meeting to educate, inform, and get general feedback in the initial stages of the project. Staff has held one community meeting on October 20th, and as the town manager stated, the next one is scheduled for tomorrow at 6:30 via Zoom. Information is on makemoraga.home.org. Staff has also kicked off an extensive outreach process. Tonight we are continuing with another foundational meeting, a comprehensive housing legislative update. The key drivers include the regional housing needs allocation and methodology, the final Plan Bay Area 2050, and key legislation from the state. With all the recent state laws, we are taking a more strategic approach by presenting information upfront prior to council establishing a policy framework. Eric Phillips, with a partner with the law firm of Burke Williams and Sorensen in San Francisco, is with us tonight. And his focus is in the areas of land use, real estate, and CEQA compliance. He has particular experience with the state density bonus law, the Housing Accountability Act, housing element compliance, and other housing laws. Today, I also learned that Eric's been involved with the Southern region, which is well ahead of the Northern region on the housing element updates. So it's really, we're really happy to have him here tonight. Mr. Phillips serves as the Vice President of Policy and Legislation for the California chapter of the American Planning Association, and I've heard him a number of times, and so we have invited him. He also holds a degree in Urban and Regional Studies from Cornell University and a JD from the UC Berkeley School of Law. So without any further delay, I'd like to present Eric for the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members, for having me at your meeting this evening. As was just set up by staff, I'm going to go through some slides where I'm going to try and summarize some of the developments that we've seen in Sacramento, not only from this current legislative session that just ended, but reaching back a few years. There have been a number of developments that will greatly influence the work that you're embarking on now as you do your current housing element update. So to make sure that we're all starting from the same place of knowledge and are drawing from the right resources, I'm going to spend a little time recapping some of the key housing element laws, as well as other important housing laws that are not part of the housing element, to help give some context for both why the housing element is important and what it will mean as you move forward through the next 8 years of housing element implementation, reviewing and approving or denying housing development projects. And as you can see here, there's a number of laws. I'm only going to touch on a few of them since we only have an hour for discussion and your questions tonight. But in addition to the laws on the screen, there's just been a lot of legislative interest and activity in trying to remove barriers to housing production and increase the ability to more quickly and more affordably develop housing throughout jurisdictions in California. And the legislature has taken a very specific tact on doing that by really focusing on the efforts of local governments. Local governments have been identified as one of the key barriers to housing production by the legislature. So the legislature's solutions have been on both increasing the requirements on how local governments plan to approve housing, and then limiting the amount of authority local governments have when they're reviewing housing projects. There's a lot of focus on making the development review process faster, more predictable, and less discretionary on behalf of local decision makers. So I want to make sure that everyone is keeping that in mind, that is the legislature's intended goal with this set of legislation that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I'm going to try and highlight some of the key obligations and hopefully highlight some opportunities that you have to still do good, meaningful planning work and governance for the town as you embrace the next 8 years of planning for housing. So, as you know, you're in the midst of, or you're about to begin your housing element update process. The housing element is a state requirement. It's a component of the town's general plan, and it requires every city and county in California to show that it has enough land that's available for housing production to accommodate a specific amount of housing. And the technical term is the Regional Housing Need Allocation, or the RHNA. So there's a lot of talk about the RHNA allocation. I'm sure as you've been going through the beginning of your housing element update process, you've heard quite a bit about the RHNA. And what the RHNA represents is the total number of units that the state and ABAG, the regional government, have decided that the town needs to plan for over an 8-year planning period. And what we see here is the 6th cycle RHNA that will be incorporated into the upcoming housing element update. A little over 1,100 total units of housing that the town is being asked to plan for and to accommodate. But the RHNA isn't just focused on that total number, it's also focused on individual income categories that the RHNA has to show not just the capacity to develop these 1,100 units, but there has to be land that's available to develop a little over 500 units that could be available at extremely low, very low, and low income levels, 172 units of moderate, with the balance then being for above moderate income households. So it's a combination of planning for both the amount of housing and the type of housing that can be affordable to the income levels that are shown here on the slide. So where we are in the process right now, the state and ABAG, our regional government, have determined the local RHNA. That was what was on the last slide. The state has also defined the specific requirements that must go into the housing element. That's what I'm about to cover next. And that will show the type of information and the type of planning and the type of requirements that will be incorporated into your housing element document. As I mentioned right at the beginning, part of the reason we're doing the update is that the laws have changed quite a bit. They're quite different from the last time the town updated its housing element. So there's many new requirements, and the process of preparing a housing element is more challenging than it's been in the past. But ultimately, you will get to the place where you have a housing element that you approve and adopt, and that will be sent to the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, and HCD will then review first your draft housing element, then after you adopt the housing element, the final housing element, and make a determination about whether or not the housing element has satisfied all of the legal requirements And if so, it will then certify that as a legally compliant housing element. And we'll talk in just a little bit about both what those requirements are and what happens if we're not able to meet them. But as alluded to right at the beginning, starting in 2018, there were some significant changes at the state level that caused an increase in RHNA, so that 1,100 units that you're being asked to plan for are much higher than housing needs have been identified by the state in the past. And that's true statewide. That's a trend that we're seeing. Cities and counties everywhere have seen between a 50% to a 100%, some places more than doubling, or some places even tripling the amount of RHNA that they've been asked to accommodate. In addition, the way that RHNA gets distributed among jurisdictions has changed a little bit. There's much more focus on putting housing in high opportunity areas like Moraga. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is a big component of how the housing needs were distributed throughout the COG. And then things that used to be used to hold housing numbers down are no longer allowed to be factored in by ABAG. So that all of these together led to that 1,100 or so number in the town's RHNA for the 6th cycle. But the key requirement to putting the housing element together is to identify a site inventory, a list of all the parcels in the town that are available for housing development at those individual incomes that I was showing on the first slide. So the way that is satisfied is that any site that can accommodate 20 dwelling units per acre is eligible to be considered as a housing element inventory site that could be available for lower income households, including extremely low and very low income households. There's other specific requirements that it takes to make it onto the list, but the first threshold question is it zoned appropriately at a high enough level that it can be presumed to be available for those affordability levels. So again, in Moraga, that means for the approximately 500 or so lower income households that need to be accommodated, we'll have to have zoning at 20 dwelling units an acre on enough sites to show that there's capacity to develop those 500 plus units. In addition to being able to accommodate the 1,100 units that have been assigned by ABAG, there are provisions in the housing element law that are called the no net loss provisions, which mean that as sites develop throughout the housing element cycle, if they develop differently than the housing element predicted, so that if they don't develop with the right number of units, or they don't develop at the same level of affordability that was predicted in the housing element, then the town has an obligation to identify how those units will be made up over the 8-year cycle. And the most straightforward way to do that is to have a little bit of a buffer up front. So I'll give an example from this hypothetical. These aren't real parcel numbers from Moraga, but this is a hypothetical site inventory that shows a zone that could accommodate 20 units of housing on a 2-acre site to get 40 units. In the housing element, we would identify that as being available for lower income households because that meets the medium, the assumed density for the minimum assumed density for that income category. However, if a developer came forward and built 40 units of housing that weren't affordable, that were indeed restricted or otherwise rented at affordable rents, 40 units of market rate housing, the town wouldn't get credit for the production in the lower income categories. In fact, it would have to then show where those 40 units could also be made up elsewhere in the housing element. So what HCD recommends and what a lot of jurisdictions are doing are adopting a buffer of sites to accommodate for things that will develop at different income levels than are predicted when the housing element is prepared. So rather than looking at an 1,100 unit RENA target, we're actually planning for a number that's maybe 20 to 30% larger than that, so that there's an adequate buffer of sites to draw from as they develop throughout the planning period at income levels that are different than had been predicted in the housing element. So you might be thinking, well, how are we going to accommodate all that? And the housing element requires cities and counties to go through a rezoning process. If you don't already have adequate sites that are at those minimum densities to accommodate your RENA, you have to identify sites that go on your housing element inventory that can be rezoned. And once they're rezoned, you have 3 years from adopting the housing element to implement that rezoning, to adopt the changes to your ordinance that will allow that housing to be built, with a couple of exceptions. One, if your housing element is late, then you don't get the full 3 years. You only get 1 year to adopt the zoning. So that creates an incentive to have a timely and adequate housing element up front, so that you have a little bit more time on the back end to implement your zoning regulations. There's also the opportunity to extend to 4 years if there's certain hardships or progress has been made, but it hasn't been possible to adopt the zoning. But that comes up infrequently. But the important aspect of this is that any rezoning that's done to accommodate the RENA that you've been assigned has to allow housing to develop by right if it has at least 20% of its units reserved for lower income households. So that means on that 40 unit site, that 2 acre site with 40 units that was in my hypothetical site inventory, if a developer comes forward with a 40 unit project and 8 of those units are reserved for lower income households, then the obligation of the town is to process that as a by right application. And what that means is that there's no discretionary approvals, no use permits that can be required. The town is allowed to hold design review. However, the design review is not something that would qualify as a project under CEQA, which means that the design review is really limited to comparing the development that's been proposed to any objective standards and very little discretion about the project itself. There might be some opportunity to have conditions of approval after design review if the design doesn't meet the town's objective design standards. But apart from that, there's very little opportunity to come up with ad hoc modifications to projects that are consistent with the zoning. The other important thing to know about a by right project is because there aren't discretionary review except for this very limited design review. There's no discretionary actions. That means that the project is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So there won't be a second opportunity to do an EIR or a mitigated negative declaration on housing developments that are being brought forward that are consistent with the housing element. So it's really important that any environmental work be done in conjunction with the housing element itself, because that very well could be one of the last touch points that the town council has for deciding how potential impacts would be mitigated on individual sites that are brought forward. Another challenge of the current housing element cycle is that it's a little bit harder than it used to be to rely on old sites that have been included in previous housing elements. In order to rely on a vacant site that has been in 2 past housing elements, or a non-vacant site that's been in any previous housing element, those sites have to also be rezoned to allow for that same sort of by right development that I was just talking about on the previous slide. So if we have sites that were identified in the 5th cycle housing element that haven't developed yet, there might be the opportunity to bring some of those forward and use them again. However, if they were also used in the fourth cycle, if they were vacant, or if they were non-vacant, just the fact that they were used in the fifth cycle would require them to be rezoned and made for by right housing. So again, it's important to make sure that they're analyzed appropriately in connection with your housing element update now. I alluded to the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing very briefly when I was talking about how the RHNA has been distributed throughout the region. But it's also a concept that has been newly introduced into housing element requirements on a site-by-site basis. So what affirmatively furthering fair housing means is that the town has a statutory obligation to take meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers or that restrict access to opportunities. And HCD has recently published very extensive guidance on how to take that sort of lofty statutory language and that goal and translate it into analysis and policies that you'll see in your housing element. I know that your housing element team has already provided background on the type of outreach and analysis they're going to do to assess the fair housing opportunities. But what's really important when you're going forward to prepare your housing element is thinking about how those relate to the sites that you're picking to include in your housing element, and what sort of policies, goals, and actions you will prioritize in your plan in order to accomplish the goals that I had on the last slide about reducing barriers and overcoming past patterns of segregation. And to make that a little bit more specific, I have some examples from HCD in terms of things that they have identified as barriers to fair housing opportunities. So for example, if there are predominantly single-family uses within jurisdictions that have racially concentrated areas of influence, that could be viewed as a fair housing issue. So if we have not the ability to create different types of housing products, despite being a high opportunity zone, that creates what HCD would view as a barrier to fair housing, and then an opportunity to create new policies to address that barrier. And the types of solutions that HCD identifies for an issue like that would be to increase the variety of housing types that are allowed to be developed in the zoning code, relaxing development standards to make it a little easier or more affordable to build so that housing becomes more accessible to people who need it. Other fair housing policies that HCD is pressing jurisdictions to include involve things like coming up with incentives to promote affordable housing development or promote ADU development. SB 9 is quite new, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but promoting other ways of developing housing. Those are all things that jurisdictions can do upfront to try and get some credit from the state for trying to reduce barriers to housing, but also just making sure that your site inventory and your zoning has adequate land and land that it can be developed as accessible housing or for supportive housing or for senior housing, group homes and residential care facilities. Those are all special types of housing that serve groups that have specific housing needs, and HCD is going to be looking very closely to make sure that the zoning can appropriately accommodate all those different housing types within the town. And this is an area, again, it's very new. HCD's guidance only came out earlier this year, but it's one of the focuses that HCD has put as they've been reviewing draft elements in the San Diego region, in the Southern California, Greater Los Angeles region. They're putting a lot of emphasis on making sure that the analysis around barriers and the prioritized policies for breaking down those barriers match the guidance that they've published. So it's an area that we have to pay a lot of attention to as you're going forward with the housing element update. And then just to give a sense of the timing, The housing element itself is due on January 31st, 2023. That still sounds like far away, but there's quite a bit of work between now and then to identify the sites, to do the right level of environmental analysis, to do the right level of outreach to accomplish. So the fact that you're getting started now is not too early. AB 215 is a new bill that was just signed by the governor last month. It modified the process that each CD uses to review your draft housing element. As I mentioned right at the beginning, when you adopt a draft housing element, you send that to each CD for comment. They'll evaluate it and let you know what changes they think need to be made. However, before you send your draft to HCD, now the draft has to circulate for at least 30 days of public review. And if you get any comments on the draft, you have to have at least 10 business days to think about how to incorporate those comments before you send the draft to HCD. So that builds in really a 6-week lead time before you can send your draft to HCD after the draft is ready. And now HCD also has 90 days to review their draft, which has been increased from 60 days. So you have to get it to HCD a little bit earlier than you used to in order to make sure that you get their feedback and can incorporate their comments before you adopt the final housing element. And the final housing element is due January 31. No real penalties kick in until 120 days, the end of May, after that date. But the housing element is technically late if it's not adopted by January 31, 2023. So if the housing element is late or the housing element is legally inadequate, there's a number of penalties that the town could face. I mentioned this earlier, but any rezoning that the housing element identifies as being necessary, if the housing element isn't adopted on time, it has to be, the zoning has to be completed within 1 year instead of having 3 years to finish it. If you miss that 120-day grace period after the actual due date, then the state puts you on a 4-year update cycle. Ordinarily, housing elements, you have to go through this process once every 8 years. If you're late, you have to do it every 4 years. And any RHNA that you didn't adequately plan for then gets added to the next cycle. Right now, you get basically a reset button. The RHNA is new RHNA. You don't have to worry about what you did or didn't do for the 5th cycle. But if your housing element isn't adopted, that RHNA rolls over and you have to plan for even more housing going forward. Having a certified housing element is a prerequisite for access to lots of state funds. But even probably the biggest risk is that not having a state certified housing element puts you at risk for legal challenge. Private lawsuits can lead to courts either taking away your land use control, not allowing you to approve anything, even like local permits to redo kitchens and bathrooms and that kind of thing, all the way to the court going the other direction and ordering you to approve certain projects, even if they don't comply with your general plan. So having a legally adequate housing element is an important way to protect yourself from having a court come in and tell you what projects to approve just on its own. And then the last thing I'll say about housing elements before we quickly go through some of the other key housing legislation is just that the state has really increased its focus on implementation and accountability. One of the centerpieces of Governor Newsom's budget this year was a new housing accountability unit created within HCD to make sure that jurisdictions were following through on the policies and the commitments that they make in their housing element, so that it doesn't just sit on the shelf somewhere and get ignored. And HCD specifically now has statutory authority to revoke housing element compliance if they think that you're not implementing your policies, or refer violations to the Attorney General. So the state is going to have a much more active role in making sure that jurisdictions follow through on the commitments that they make in their housing element. Quickly, I'm just going to do a brief survey of some of the other key laws that then will affect implementation of the housing element. The first is the Housing Crisis Act, or SB 330. This is a bill that was first adopted in 2019. It was extended this year, so now its provisions run all the way through the beginning of 2030. And SB 330 created a new statewide Housing Crisis Act that bans certain housing limitations. So basically what it says is that the town is not allowed to downzone any of its residential areas or adopt new development standards that would reduce residential capacity unless you do corresponding upzoning elsewhere. So there's limited ways of working around that, but for the most part, the residential development that's allowed today is the baseline level that has to be allowed going forward, and anything else is to be additive, not to be more restrictive. SB 330 also limits the town's ability to adopt development moratoria on residential development, and any new design standards that you adopt can't be enforced against residential projects unless they're objective standards. And that's also going to be helpful for any projects that are reviewed as a by right project, because you would need those to be objective standards to apply them in that context anyway. SB 330 also changed a number of the state's other housing processing laws. It created a new, what they call a preliminary application, which lets a developer vest or lock in, freeze the development standards and the development impact fees that are in place the day that they submit their preliminary application. The town then has to do an application review after the formal development application is submitted. The Permit Streamlining Act requires the town to evaluate the application for completeness within 30 days. Once the application is complete, the town has to give the applicant notice of any objective development standards that the project is not consistent with. And if it doesn't do that, the project could be deemed to be consistent with those standards. If a project is already compliant with the zoning and the general plan, so it doesn't need any legislative approvals, it's either a by right project or a project that just needs a use permit. SB 330 limits only to 5 hearings that can be used to review that project. And then ultimately, once a project is up for review and approval, it is protected by the limitations of the Housing Accountability Act. That's the next law I'm going to talk about quickly. The Housing Accountability Act applies to all housing development projects and emergency shelters. That means affordable and market rate projects, and it includes mixed use projects as long as at least 2/3 of the project square footage are residential. And what the Housing Accountability Act does is it says that if a project complies with objective standards, then the town can only reduce the density of that project or deny that project if it makes findings about a specific adverse impact to public health and safety, and that there's no other way to mitigate that impact other than denying the project or reducing the density. It's a very difficult finding to make. So the upshot of that is that a project that's consistent with objective standards is very difficult to turn down. So what is an objective standard? And I've used that term a couple different times. It's relevant to SB 330, it's relevant to by right approvals, but an objective standard means that it's something that involves no subjective judgment. You can look it up, it's universally referenceable, there's a uniform benchmark for it. Basically, it means that if 2 people can come to a different interpretation, it probably isn't objective. Things like height, setback, lot coverage, anything you can quantify and measure would be objective and enforceable. But things that you typically have used in planning documents, like reflecting the look and feel of the community or avoid obstructing views, be physically suited for the proposed development, having a site that's physically suited for the proposed development. These are all standards that have been found to not be objective in different lawsuits in the state and have not been allowed to be used as a basis to deny a project or reduce its density, even though they're things that you will see in planning documents throughout California. I mentioned earlier that a project can be deemed consistent if you don't give notice of inconsistencies with your objective standards, but that's not the only way that a project can be deemed consistent. The Housing Accountability Act kind of turns the old standard of review on its head. Typically, in a land use case, a court would give a lot of deference to the town who adopted its own zoning regulations to interpret those and apply them. And if the town felt like something wasn't consistent, the court would be inclined to agree. But with the Housing Accountability Act, if there's evidence in the record that would allow a reasonable person to conclude that it's consistent, which means like if the applicant has their own evidence that a judge finds convincing, then the court can use that instead of the town's determination to say that the project was consistent and should have been approved. It also has a much higher standard of review and evidentiary burden on the town if the town were to deny a project. You still have to go through CEQA to the extent that the project is subject to CEQA. So the HAA isn't a total get out of jail free card for an applicant, but it is a very powerful tool that really boxes in the town's discretion when it's reviewing housing projects. And then the last two things I'm going to talk about very quickly before I circle back and see what questions you all have are two bills that take that even one step further. The first is SB 35, which is a streamlining bill. It subjects cities and counties in California to its provisions if they're not building enough housing to satisfy their RHNA. So all the way back at the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about that RHNA allocation that the state has given us. If during the next 8-year cycle, the private market isn't delivering units at a pace to keep up with that 1,100 unit production over the next 8 years, then SB 35 will apply to the town. And what SB 35 says is that a project that includes 2 or more units and that is consistent with all of the town's objective standards and that pays prevailing wage is eligible for a streamlined ministerial review. It's exempt from CEQA. It can't be subject to ad hoc conditions of approval, and it has to be reviewed and approved within either 90 days or 180 days, depending on the size of the project. So very quick time frame, and again, totally ministerial review. So that means no discretionary actions. The only authority that the town has is to look at the project and say, does this comply with our objective standards? If it does, we're obligated to approve it. Right now, projects have to meet a 50% affordability threshold, meaning half their units have to be reserved for lower income households if they want to use SB 35 in Moraga. However, if in the next housing element cycle, production falls and above moderate housing is not being done at pace, then projects might be able to qualify for SB 35 with as little as 10% of their units being affordable. There are certain exclusions. There's a number of environmental factors that would keep a project from being able to use SB 35. SB 35 can't be used to remove housing where tenants have been living at any point within the last 10 years. But otherwise, it's a very powerful, quick process for the developer to use. And the last thing that I'll talk about is SB 9. Again, this is a bill that was just adopted this year. It was very popular in the press. I'm sure that you all have heard about it. But it's another streamlining bill that creates a new ministerial process. And again, ministerial means no discretion, no CEQA. And basically, SB 9 requires that any single family zone allow up to 2 units to develop per parcel. So where we have a single family home now, instead of building an ADU, a homeowner has the ability to build a duplex or 2 freestanding units. It also requires the town to ministerially approve a lot split. So a lot that's big enough can be divided into 2, and then each of those new lots can have 2 units built on them. So at the end of the day, what SB 9 does is it allows a homeowner to build a project with 4 units in a single family zone, where otherwise they would only have the ability to build 1 unit of housing plus an ADU. There's a number of requirements that have to be met for a developer to use SB 9. It has the same environmental limitations that are included in SB 35. So there's some limitations, but in general, it creates a path for a quick and direct process for an applicant to create more housing units on their single family lot. And there's a number of specific technical requirements. I know you got the slides in advance. I won't belabor all of the specific hoops that an applicant has to jump through or what they have to do to qualify, unless you all have questions on it. But I did want to at least brief you on the fact that this is a new requirement that the state has put forward that will make it easier for some homeowners to develop housing, and that is important to plan for. So I'll pause there and see what questions there might be, and we can circle back to any of those topics and any of the slides that you all are interested in.
Okay, could you unshare your screen, please?
Yes.
Thank you. It's hard for me to see hands. Okay, question. A very good presentation, by the way. Thank you very much. I don't know if you're getting sleepy, Renata, or not. Councilmember Sauce.
No, I'm wide awake. Eric, thank you. That was really comprehensive, and thank you very much for sort of walking us through that. You know, the state clearly is upping the ante on noncompliance with some pretty, big sticks. Loss of funding, and that sort of thing. Generally speaking, how is noncompliance assessed? Because some of the standards in these particular pieces of legislation, like the local government or the local government will have the burden of proving its action was legal, and the court. No, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. The jurisdiction must not take any action that is materially inconsistent with its obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. That's pretty loosey-goosey. How is that assessed, and who assesses it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations are somewhat new, so we're still waiting to see exactly how the state is going to enforce those. The first line of defense or offense, I guess depending on which way you're looking at it, is having the housing element certified to begin with. Each CD is giving very detailed feedback. I know they have a rigorous checklist that they're using to evaluate a draft housing element. So the first step would be to work with HCD to identify whether or not your housing element is adequate to affirmatively further fair housing, and that it identifies those policies and prioritizes implementing them in a way that the state agrees would affirmatively further fair housing. And then once that has happened, once you have HCD buy-in and they certify that your housing element is legal, I think you probably are on pretty safe ground as long as you follow through with those commitments and the time frame in the housing element. As you're adopting the housing element, you'll come up with policies. Maybe there'll be a rezoning policy or a program to promote ADU development or different things like that. And they will have timeframes associated with them that you will have adopted the rezoning within 3 years, or you will have tried to do outreach to homeowners to let them know that they can build ADUs, and you'll have that published on the city's website within 1 year and things like that. And as long as you're checking off the commitments that you've made up front, you're probably pretty safe. Where you could run into trouble is if you're falling way behind on your obligations, if you're not seeing housing being produced and you're missing the other deadlines and commitments that you've made in the housing element. What I've seen in other jurisdictions and in past housing element cycles is that it's not an instant penalty. HCD starts with a reach out, they'll send a letter, they try to work with the jurisdiction before ratcheting up those other enforcement tools that they have. So they'll give you notice, they'll give you the opportunity to work with them to try and either amend your housing element, or come up with new policies, or come up with a way of getting yourself out of trouble before you're in too much trouble, basically. And then it's only if at that point the town's not being responsive, or there's a big disconnect between what the state wants and what the town wants, that we'd be likely to see HCD taking those more drastic steps of revoking housing element compliance or making a referral to the Attorney General.
Thank you. Other questions, Vice Mayor?
Yeah, likewise, boy. Mayor McClure and I have been representatives to ABAG for the last couple of years, and it's been fascinating to watch this process. Fascinating is one way to say it. I'm getting pretty snarky about the whole thing. And I sure hope that HCD is subjected to objective standards, just like we're subjected to some objective standards, and that if they don't meet the schedule, then it's assumed that we've passed. But anyway, it's more relevant. You know, SB 379 addresses safety and, you know, having to review and update your safety processes, procedures, and I think including egress. And the interesting thing about it is, you know, we're faced with increasing our housing stock by almost 20%, and yet, you know, SB 379 doesn't envision the possibility that we cannot safely egress from town, especially when you take into account that our egress, you know, we have some major stakeholders down the road called Lafayette and Orinda, and they're also having to increase by about 20%. And gee, when I don't see any option that says, what's the, you know, what point, if it's not safe, do we get relief? Am I incorrect on that, or is there a relief valve, so to speak, that at some point you can say, well, even though Moraga was originally zoned for about 55,000, no, that's not gonna work in our environment anymore. You know, with the safety aspects, fire, emergency egress. Any guidance on that? Thoughts?
I can try to respond a little bit, and then Eric, if you want to add. So on SB 379, what we do need to do is an analysis and a study. And then based on that study, we will work with MOFD and police. What I've also learned recently through the Contra Costa County planning directors is that we will have to collaborate with Lafayette and Orinda at some point on this and work with them. And then what we'll have to do is probably bring any mitigation measures forward to see what we can do. Eric, if you want to jump in, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly agree with everything that you just said, and the other point to add on would just be that there isn't, since we're talking about evacuation and traffic, I'll use the metaphor that it's not an off-ramp for us here to use. So because ingress and egress is constrained, that gives us an off-ramp for meeting the housing obligation. And in theory, that's part of what EBAG was considering when they were allocating the RENA. That's supposed to be baked in, and now the obligation is to figure out how to accommodate that and what other things need to be done to make sure that your coordination with other jurisdictions, as Director Hamid was just saying, is occurring, and that the development can occur safely. But the state is not looking to provide an opportunity to say that we're too constrained to accommodate the amount of housing that you're asking us to plan for.
Safety is priority one for having a town government, and somehow we're going to have to address this. I don't know how we're going to do it, but somehow we're going to have to do it.
Okay. Any other questions? Councilmember Onoda.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And Councilmember Wallachy, I agree 100%. Safety is number one with every decision we make. I've got a question, Eric, and thank you for such a good summary of all of these SBs. You know, it's nice to see them all lined up. One thing that you said, and I don't know exactly which one it was, but if the town zones and upzones areas and the people who own the properties decide not to build, and we have the deadline of 8 years, what happens then?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a couple of different things that go into that. First is that if there are developed uses on the sites that you're looking to include, and obviously in a place like Moraga, which is a lot of development already, you're going to be likely looking at redevelopment opportunities more than vacant property. But you have to have done some analysis that shows why you think that site's going to develop or redevelop over the next 8 years. And in some instances, I've seen HCD going as far as to say that you need to work with the property owner in advance. They have to, write a letter that says, yes, I'm interested in developing housing over the next 8 years, and therefore that will help provide evidence that housing development is likely here, and the town should get credit for it while it's planning in the housing element cycle. So there's a little bit of an analytical threshold that you have to meet to include those sites to begin with. Having said that, that certainly doesn't guarantee that any of those sites will actually develop, or that even if a property owner says, yes, I really want to do that, it doesn't obligate them to follow through and produce the units. So at the end of the housing cycle, as long as your housing element was adopted on time, and those sites were available throughout the planning period, it will reset. At cycle 7, you don't have to carry over those unbuilt units and plan for them again. You'll get a new allocation. In the meantime, if those sites aren't developing and other sites are developing, you'll get credit for those being, every building permit you issue, even if it wasn't on a site you predicted for housing development, counts towards your housing production. Every year, your annual progress report that goes to HCD will show how much development has happened, and that will be used towards your SB 35 determination about whether or not you're subject to the requirements of SB 35. But if not enough housing is being produced, just because the property owners aren't developing it, then in the meantime, you could be subject to SB 35, either at that 50% affordability level, or if you're also not meeting your above moderate income housing production numbers, a 10% level of affordability could be enough to trigger SB 35. So there's a variety of different, outcomes that happen at different times in the process based on what's developing or not developing.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Questions? Yes, Councilmember Sauce.
Did you have a question, Mr. Mayor? Because I've already asked one. I want to make sure I defer.
I do not. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I guess this is a question more for Afsha. So you mentioned and I think it was mentioned in the presentation or in one of your answers to the question that there's a collaborative of planning directors and legal teams that are working together, which is great to see because we're all confronting the same problems. But my question goes, I think, to the vice mayor's question, which is, we are, of course, on the transportation side of the house, everybody's updating their action plans, right? Their sub-regional plans for transportation and for congestion and for traffic. And I am just, and obviously the RENA allocations are one of the new factors that will go into the updates of the action plans. So I'm just wondering, do we have overlap there? Are there touch points between what the planning directors are doing at the La Marinda and the county level with what the transportation analysis that is occurring, certainly for La Marinda?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there's CCTA, Contra Costa Transportation Authority.
Right.
And all of us, so the planning directors plus public works director, we're all involved in quarterly meetings. I would say more than quarterly meetings with CCTA. And what we do have to do is coordinate. So there are some areas, for example, SB 743, which is a requirement. It's been part of state law since 2019. We're including it in our housing element. And right now, what we're doing is coordinating it with our engineering staff, and this will also be coordinated at the county level as well. So where there are opportunities to be collaborative and to coordinate and to align, we are being very proactive in terms of doing that. And then the other one that I mentioned is because there's so much coming at us, ABAG has given us what they've done is provided us a collaborative. So all of the planning directors and ABAG are meeting every 2 weeks, and they've assigned us a consultant and 2 consultants, in fact. So when we have larger issues, for example, like more deeply understanding AFFH, what are some examples for small jurisdictions and how can we meet AFFH requirements? We'll be getting a deep dive presentation on that. So we're already asking all these much larger questions. And then we have a separate planning directors meeting that takes place, I believe every 2 months. So we're discussing a lot of these issues. So at the staff level, we've taken on a very collaborative role in Contra Costa County.
Thank you, Afsha, and I'm glad you have that many more meetings now to attend.
Yes.
Okay, I see Vice Mayor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. And this may build off what Afsha just referred to, but I'd like to get any feedback, potential solutions to what I see is a conundrum of where the requirements being imposed on us, because we and Lafayette and Orinda have been identified as areas of opportunity. And it was a little bit disturbing when we suddenly saw in some of these meetings, La Marinda actually identified, and people asking, well, where's La Marinda? From the South Bay and what have you. But we've been identified as area of high opportunity, which means we get more homes. Oh boy. And at the same time, it's recognized that we are a location of high construction cost. Interesting that the two correlate, huh? But so now I wonder, is there any efforts being made to see how you handle this conflicting problem where we've got high construction costs here, but we've got to put in really extremely low income housing, and how does that work? I know, church parking lots donated and things like that are some of the scenarios, but I wonder, is there any effort being made where you know, some of these solutions are cataloged and or identified so that we can leverage off that and see how we might work through that issue. And I don't know if Eric's been aware of such or Ash Offshaw.
Yeah,
Is that out of scope? Is that out of scope for tonight? If so, that's fine.
well, I'll start with a couple of quick thoughts. I mean, one, the policy tension that you highlight, I think is exactly right on, that by focusing development in higher opportunity areas that are also higher cost areas, it limits the opportunity on how many units you can create. Like there's definitely a tension there. I think one of the things that the state is looking to do, there's two things that the state is looking to do on that front. One is to provide additional funding resources. That the state budget this year actually had quite a bit of funding sources to help with land acquisition and write down some of those development costs. So that is a little bit more of the carrot approach. Then the stick approach that the state is starting to take is really focusing on things like development impact fees and other things that the town can control that relate to those development costs, and trying to come up with ways to limit what you can charge and what those construction costs are. So far, the bills in that space haven't gained a ton of traction. There's been some reforms around the margins about how impact fees are calculated and how nexus studies are done. But I expect if you have me back next year to do a similar update, one of the things we'll be talking about would be legislative efforts to curb development impact fees and try and bring development costs down, which isn't, I know, the most positive answer to your question, but definitely one of the things that the state is focusing on.
Eric, especially when, go ahead. Go.
I would like to kind of couple what Eric is saying. There's a lot of costs that we're aware of. So for example, one of the costs is parking. Parking can be a high cost. So where you have more density, you know, there's possibilities of looking at your ordinances to reduce parking, because that adds to the cost of construction. And then also the type of parking that you know, that could be proposed. So if it's a structured parking, it's more costly, about $50,000 per space, versus surface parking. But then, you know, you want to balance surface parking by maybe looking at reducing parking. And then the other things, there are, maybe not in La Miranda area, but in other areas of the Bay, there are different construction types that are being discussed. So one is Factory OS, which is, you know, modular units. And if you've ever taken a tour, or if you've ever looked at it, they look exactly like a normal unit. And they're done with wages, union wages, and they're much more efficient. And you can skin the outside however you want. So there's a lot of different ways. And then the third thing that I know Barry and his team talked about was missing middle housing. And looking at housing that is lower cost to construct, and looking at ways to encourage that type of development more.
Yeah, and those types of strategies, those are all excellent suggestions, and some of those are even things that HCD has identified in their written guidance. Like, for example, relaxed parking standards to reduce development costs are identified as an example policy to create fair housing opportunities. So that's the type of thing that can be incorporated to reduce development costs, and then speak to the questions that were being asked earlier about what are some of the other activities we can do towards that affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation.
So I have a question, Afsha. If we actually start to reduce parking, and maybe people go to e-bikes, but where are people going to park?
So one of the things is what we experienced through the discussion of the MCSP and the adoption of the MCSP is we already looked at more relaxed standards. So that's something that's not new to Moraga. And if we look at the Green Park specific plan area, and depending on the policies that the council decides, we can look at some additional relaxed standards over there too.
Okay.
Wait a minute, on the street parking, Mike. Is that not correct, Afsha, on street parking?
Well, that's already being done with ADUs.
Right.
The state has already said for ADUs, you don't need on-site parking.
But not only we require off-street parking, don't we?
Normally, we require on-site parking.
Right.
And in the case of jurisdictions where they're relaxing parking standards, these are usually in transit-rich areas where people can use public transit. So that will be a challenge for Moraga for sure.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric. It was very well done. And Afsha.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it very much. So are we ready to move on to 10C? I'm sorry?
My apologies, Mr. Mayor. May I just ask a favor in whether the slides that Eric presented are going to be available to us?
Yes, they will be available. I apologize for not distributing them earlier. We
That's fine.
received them. But we will put them on the website and we can email them to council members as well.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to make a comment, and that is to thank staff so much for providing us summaries on these bills, and even better to get these slides. And I've looked at some of the attachments, and it's a daunting task, you know. And we're looking at a small number of all the bills that are being either already passed or considered for passing. It's to me it's daunting. I'm not yet sure that it's feasible what is being required of us, but I know we're gonna make a go at it.
Okay, tell you what, we're 2 hours plus in, so let's take a 5-minute break.
Mayor,
Yes?
excuse me, before we break for a bit, I would recommend we go to public comment. I don't
Okay.
see any hands, but there might be somebody who wants to speak. on the
Okay,
topic.
very good. Yeah, I got in between questions and comments.
Yes.
Let's open for public comment. Do we have any public comment on this topic? If you would like to comment, please raise your hand. I see Kendall Langdon.
Yes, Council, these are subjects that we've been talking about for some time. I thought that presentation was really quite good. I made several notes that I will be bringing this to others who I know would be very interested in this presentation. I do not think the general public has any clue about what we just saw. And as I said earlier, I don't think very many people are watching this. And so although you have every reason to believe everybody's listening to you, they're not. And so the problem is, how do the general public of Moraga really know what was just said? These are very, very dramatic. I think some people would call them draconian. Some people are going to say, what can we do to prevent this from happening? But if you just unpeel what we just heard, it's quite dramatic. What could potentially happen? And by the way, I own commercial property in downtown Moraga. So I guess now I should plan on building a 10-story building. So I think everyone needs to really think about this presentation. This presentation was one of the reasons I ran for town council, because I found out about this through information that I got from people involved in government. And so this is a very serious matter. This is a very, very, very serious matter. And you cannot just brush this under the rug. These are issues that are going to have to be addressed. This is why I ran for office. And so now I also own commercial downtown property. And we have just been challenged. You know, so like this lawyer who gave us some great slides has essentially challenged us because we have to come up with some answers. And there's a timeline we have to come up with some answers for. And so if someone ever says that I've denigrated anybody on this town council, I have not. But I have called truth, and I'm calling truth now. And I really appreciate whoever brought this guy on to the town council for this presentation tonight. I'm happy, but I'm very unhappy that the general community of Moraga has no clue about what has just happened and the information that was just presented. And so I charge every single one of you, you wonderful town council members, let the people know what is the problem. What you need to let the people know everything that's going on. And Cynthia Battenberg, town manager, this should be your responsibility. There should be some kind of campaign for mailing or emailing or
3 minutes.
standing up and telling everybody what just happened. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Kendall, as a follow-up question, are you aware that staff has started the communication process with the community by holding a town hall on October 20 and one tomorrow, Thursday, the 28th at 6:30?
I was unable to attend the first one. I will be attending the one tomorrow. I will be very interested to know what the numbers of people who are attending those. I am questioning whether those are the solution. I don't know what the answer is. I think that we all have to rethink about how the information of what we're talking about is getting out to people who just really don't have time to care about these things, but they're quite important.
Yeah, point well taken. Thank you. Any other public comment, please raise your hand if you'd like to make public comment on this topic. I see no more hands raised, so I'm closing public comment. And now I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break, returning at 8:50, please.
Mayor,
And
may I
please
just
turn
make a quick comment?
Go ahead.
I would just like to thank Eric Phillips and the entire Burke Williams and Sorensen team. And thank you so much for the presentation and for the support that they've provided. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if everybody will turn off their video and audio during the recess period.